This next project is based on line systems, value gradation, and directional dominance. First, we're going to talk about line direction. We talked about this in the first two projects. The idea is that horizontal lines implies quiet and repose, vertical lines imply strength and stability, and diagonal lines imply motion and action. When used repetitively, lines can create a directional flow, causing the viewer's eye to move around the picture plane. As we talked about in the second project, that idea that we're trying to not allow the viewer's eyes to stay in one place but keep moving. This is a piece by Sol LeWitt. Notice, even though this is just made of line, that there's movement within it. Subtle changes in the movement cause your eye to flow up and down the page. Compared to this piece by Agnes Martin, where all the lines are a little more similar, it's a little more stagnant, but just subtle changes in how close or far away the lines are create interest and variety. Directional conflict helps to create a focal point. For example, can you spot the focal point in this piece? Obviously right here, right in the center where we see those changes. This piece is similar, where we have one line, big line going through the middle, creating a directional conflict. And even though these lines are going horizontally, our eye movement heads up and across the page, creating a diagonal composition. Implied line also plays a role in directional dominance. If you remember back to our opening PowerPoint, implied lines are created when by stopping points or when we connect the dots. For example, in here, do you notice with the implied line is created? A little box right around that center. If you remember this piece back from the beginning PowerPoint, the letter that's created through implied line is an S. The next project also has to do with line as value. Lines packed together can create visual depth and the illusion of volume through value gradation. Value is the relative degree of light and dark in a design. Line placement, proximity, and size create value. So the further apart lines are, the lighter the value. The closer together, the darker the value. Shading, there are different shading techniques that we use through line. And we're going to use all three of these in the next project. The first is hatching. Through hatching, we create a series of straight or curved lines called a set, drawn beside one another to give the illusion of value. Cross-hatching is a shading technique in which one set of lines crosses or overlaps the other set. So it's essentially two sets of hatching lines. Stippling involves covering an area with dots. It is a wildly time-consuming technique because you have to fill it in dot by dot. As we looked at in the first PowerPoint, pointillism is based on this technique. There's also a technique known as scribbling. Scribbling actually has many different names, including scumbling, circling, and squirking. Essentially, this technique involves shading in random or circular strokes, so not quite as regular as that hatching or cross hatching. Blending, also known as smooth shading, is where you use your finger or smudge tool to make it into a more uniform shape. Controlled correctly, this can give a smooth, polished look. Because we're using pen to complete our pieces with, as you can imagine, the blending technique is not going to work. So here's an example of some of these line systems and how they look compared to one another. This is exactly what you're going to do in your value exercise. You're going to complete a hatching, a cross hatching, and a stippling value scale. As mentioned before, the other part of hatching is parallel lines. And value is determined from the density. So if you look at the chart here, the density means how many lines are can you fit within a certain area. So you can kind of see if they're thinner, you get a lot more value, lighter value within the same area. The thicker the line gets, or the more dense a line gets, the darker the value gets. Frequency can also change value, so that's how many lines you can fit within that one little box. If you look at the bottom, the first box has 7 lines. The next box has 10 lines. The box after that has 15, so the more of those lines you add, the darker in value it gets. Cross-hatching works through the same technique. So it has to do with density, the thickness of the lines, and with the frequency. How many lines can you fit within that small area? Except this time you're using parallel lines. Here's an example of a crosshatch piece. You can see the wide variety of value that you can get within a small area. Hatching and cross-hatching techniques were commonly used for printmaking. So before we had the use of an inkjet printer, people used to have to use a printmaking technique which involved scratching into a metal plate. So hatching and cross-hatching lines were very important. Stippling is where you build up tone and dots. So it has the same thing to do, density and frequency. So how big the dots are versus how many dots you can fit within that one small area. And as mentioned before, this can be a very time-consuming technique. But it has beautiful results. There are many examples that you can see of stippling. Anytime you use an inkjet printer, that is an example of stippling. Also tattoos. If anybody's ever had a tattoo before, you know that little needle dives into the skin, leaving little dots of ink. That is actually a form of a stippling technique. So how do artists use these techniques? This is what we're going to look at next. And you have to think about how you're going to use them in this next project as well. These are some works by Tara Donovan. Now these are abstract or non-representational pieces. She's not necessarily looking at portraying anything specifically. She's really looking at form, so how she creates focal points and areas of interest and allows the viewer's eye to move around the page. So this is an example of one of her drawings. She also does installations. These are a series of small, tiny little pins. So as you can imagine, this is a very time-consuming way to do stippling. She has to hammer each one of these individually into the wall. And the shapes are only made through implied line and implied shape. So where the density and frequency of the lines change is an edge. This is something you want to think about for your piece as well, because you're trying to avoid doing hard outlines to your shapes. You're going to let where the lines or stippling stops create your forms. It's another piece by Directional Dominance. You can see they're very meticulously and beautifully done. This is another piece of hers. Instead of done with stippling, it's done with lines. I'll show you a close-up of this piece on the next slide. See there? A bunch of little individual lines, not done by outlines, but where all those little lines stop. You can think about this for your next piece. It is going to be non-representational or abstract. So you're just thinking about changing the line direction and value. And how can you create an interesting composition just using those few things? And think about some of the things that we talked about in creating emphasis and focal point. Dark contrast tends to draw the viewer's eye around the page. You really have to think about how you're going to build up those lines, whether you're going to use that very neat hatching and cross-hatching technique, or you're going to use more of a scribbling form. That's completely up to you. So let's look at some student examples. Remember, these student examples are just examples of how some students have done it. You can do it in a completely different way. It's totally up to you. Notice how there are focal points created through where the lines stop, not where through the creation of edges. You really want to think about creating a variety of value, so having some areas be darker than one another, and also that you're changing direction to create a focal point. Implied line is also very important in this project, so allowing lines to all stop at a certain point. Remember, you can map out your composition in pencil first. You can also use tape to give a nice clean stopping point to all those lines, but implied lines are going to be a very important part of this piece. Here's a few examples of some thumbnails. Remember, the first step to this is creating your thumbnails. Please turn in the thumbnail examples within the project. I think it's compositional studies is what it's marked. But turn your compositional studies in first so you can get feedback and decide which one you're going to do for your final project.